two birds produced at the Patuxent Wildlife Research Center in Maryland that had been in Florida for 5 years in the wild. In the spring of the year 2000, left Florida and appeared in mid-May in southern Illinois. The birds in the non-migratory flock had shown no indication that they were going to migrate, although they had moved around Florida from here to there. They did not show signs of going north. But it was an extremely dry spring in Florida, and the wetland on which these cranes had lived for about a year dried out. When the birds were reported in southern Illinois, they were in a flooded agricultural field. I don't know what they were eating, and I don't know what they did, where they spent the night, but we know that they were in that vicinity for about 5 days. They came to a similar field, a flooded 40-acre field beside the home of Mark Batke near Sandusky, Michigan.
The birds had come to a harvested soybean field from the year prior, and it had quite large areas of water in it in the low ground, and they were pretty much just foraging out there all day and spending their days pecking at the ground and grooming themselves. Occasionally they would fly to neighboring fields that had either soybeans or corn in it. The birds stayed for about 3 weeks. They were about the 15th of May is when they arrived, and they stayed until about the 2nd or 3rd of June. By that time, the ground had dried out and we were able to start farming again.
And then in early June, when they disappeared with the ducks and geese, he thought it was a natural chronology. But actually, the cranes had just flown over the trees into the Michigan peat complex. They were then seen by Vito Palazzola and his wife Sheila, and they took video of the birds and studied their behavior.
We come out of the plant and into harvest in early June, and we dig ponds to get to the clay to build the roads. And when the ponds flood, the fish kind of spread out through the fields and stuff, and then the water goes down and the birds come in and eat on that, and the frogs, and it's just plentiful with all kinds of food for them. And I'm the harvest foreman out there, and I have my six-wheeler there. I come driving up the road one morning, and it was just breaking daylight, going to check on some of the guys. And here's these two birds in the middle of the road, both with their wings out, sort of bouncing around and stuff. And me and Sheila and the kids were out fishing one day out there. And I asked her if she wanted to see some cool looking birds. So we went driving down the one road, and sure enough, they come walking right up to the van.
As we were sitting there, they got it, and they flew right to the tail end of the truck. And they stood at the back, and they opened their wings, and they did a little dance. And then they ended, after a little while, flew back away. But if they hadn't opened their wings, I'm not sure I'd have known what they were, because you can't see any black at all on them.
The sandhill crane that had tried to join the whooping cranes on their territory finally was accepted, and when I observed them on August 24th, the three birds were constantly together. Vito and I went to the marsh where the birds had spent most of June and July, and we found two platforms that looked like crane platforms on which the birds eventually would lay eggs. But there were no signs of eggshell fragments. I don't think the birds laid. I think it was their first year on their new territory. And perhaps if they come back next spring, they'll produce eggs and chicks in that wetland.
September and October, it began to dawn on us that it was a really important thing to try and follow these birds back to Florida that were currently in Sandusky, Michigan. The only problem with that is to do it, you need an airplane as well as a ground crew, and that's pretty expensive stuff. But Windway Corporation was really nice in that they decided to commit a pilot and an airplane and the equipment that would be needed to really pull this off.
We've been flying with Terry Kohler's planes throughout the season with our Briggsville project, and so it's been really nice. He was already fairly prepared for the whooper following, and he set up some fixed antennas onto the plane wings. We have it on the Caravan, we have it on the 182, and then they also have a 172. And they set up all 3 planes with inside antennas that hook up to a switch box, and we just hook the switch box up to the receiver and we're set to go.
The day before the pair of whooping cranes took off, it was just the nastiest day we'd seen probably yet. It was snowing, it snowed all day, and it didn't melt by the afternoon. And we saw a lot of small areas of water just freezing up. And so the birds weren't acting normal. They were foraging, but they moved very little. And they were just, basically seemed like they were just trying to conserve as much body heat as they could. And by about 11 o'clock in the afternoon, it was just, winds were like 15, 25 miles an hour. It was just nasty. We were listening to the roost, and all of a sudden, you know, the signal's just pounding, which usually means that you're getting all sorts of signal from the air, which is, you know, it's a really good signal that they're flying.
When they took off, it was pretty evident because they were south of the roost that they had been hanging out at all summer. So the tracking crew on the ground scurried and got everything together, and were able to track them for 4 hours by vehicle, which is actually pretty amazing because when a bird's flying, it doesn't necessarily fly along the roadways. So.
They got a visual on both birds the first day. They were able to see both of them flying together, and they heard both signals. But the problem is that the female's radio is a lot stronger and a lot clearer than the male's was. He was missing his antenna and all sorts of stuff. And so basically we used the female as our guide to say, you know, the pair is moving.
They probably roosted on the north side of Ohio, which means for them to do that, they would have had to have flown over the lake in snow squalls and in darkness. So I suspect the birds actually made it, or at least the female made it across the lake that night and then roosted in the wetland and didn't leave her roost until about 10 o'clock in the morning. But we don't know what happened to the male. Now, it doesn't mean the male is dead. It just means that the male might have gotten separated from the female flying across the lake in snow squalls that night, and he might be making his own way to Florida, but separately from the female, and since we can't get as good a detection range.
So we went through Ontario, went down to Detroit, and that was probably the longest day for us on the ground, because it was like we went all the way from Ontario up and around down to the southern edge of Ohio, between Ohio and West Virginia, which is where she roosted that night. And so it was basically like we were just trying to catch up all day, and we finally got there, like I think like at 9 o'clock at night or something.
Yeah, and Koji was pretty nervous when he called me, because he said, Jeb, they're in this really dirty-looking pond that looks like it's in the middle of a coal mine, and I don't know what's going to, you know, what it's like for her.
We made it through West Virginia, and she kept heading south, and we try and get a visual on her if we can, and luckily we did get to see her a couple times. It was really neat. Got some great behavior, and like we saw her flying, and we went right over her, and we kind of watched her as we were passing over, and she started to do a spiral, which is what they do when they try and rise up on a thermal. And so she started spiraling and spiraling, and she got a little bit higher, and she took off. And so we were starting to get into mountainous areas. She roosted in the very western tip of Virginia, right before it intersects with Tennessee.
And that was about the most un-whooper kind of habitat that you would ever anticipate. It's in a mountain, on a mountain stream, completely forested. You know, she had stopped somewhere in that area. So both the southern Ohio roost spot in a cloudy, at least, coal pond, and in the mountains of Virginia were two roost spots that offered the minimum of what the bird needed, which is water, and presumably gave her enough security that she was safe. But it's probably about all. You know, there wasn't any food to any great degree that was likely available at either of those two sites. The fourth day began her taking off pretty much as she had done before, about 10:30.
She's still heading pretty much on a straight direction south, you know, south by southeast.
Right after she left Virginia, this roost, she's hitting the mountains, the main part of the Appalachian chain. And at that point, she began to veer. She began to veer to the west and parallel the mountains. And she landed, by midday, she was near Greenville, Tennessee, which is southwest of her point. And this was the first time during the migration that she did anything than fly a straight line, basically between Sandusky, Michigan, and Gainesville, Florida. It seemed fairly clear that she was having problems going over the mountain. There's two explanations that might be likely, and they're not mutually exclusive of each other. One is that she needed thermals to have enough energy to give her lift to go high enough to clear the mountain range. Or two, she had already been, this was her fourth day of migration, and she had not likely fed much since the time she left Sandusky, Michigan. And it may be that her protein metabolism is such that she needed to eat. Not necessarily high energy foods, but foods that have protein and minerals and that sort of thing to help fuel her general day-to-day daily metabolism. What probably happened is she was flying and may have made another attempt to get over the Appalachians, didn't, and then came and landed about the last place that he had a location on her at midday. And so she came back to that location and chose a pretty nice spot for the first time to land. She had a nice pond where she could forage. She had alfalfa and grazed pasture nearby, right adjacent to the pond, and harvested corn.
We just kind of checked on her throughout the day and said, you know, if she's going to take off, this is most likely when she's going to take off. And for some odd reason, there were some sandhills hanging around. She took off and started to fly with them, and they kind of reacted to her. They veered off from her, and she kind of followed them for a while, and then they all kind of flew together, and they started to spiral and spiral. Like, okay, well, she might be taking off. It was a little bit later than normal. It was about 11:30 Eastern. She ended up landing back in the cow pasture, and so she spent the rest of the day there just kind of foraging, and the next day she didn't really do a whole lot. She just kind of foraged around and moved. She moved more. She created a better radius of circle of where she was going. She went further into the cow pasture, and so it seemed like she was mostly just kind of going after bugs and whatever else was there. There was, like Jeb said, a corn across the street, but she didn't ever go over there.
And she ended up sitting there for 2 days. This would be, she began her, that would be the 7th day of the migration, but her 5th migrating day. She then went through the pass towards Asheville, North Carolina, and as we're speaking, she should be somewhere in South Carolina, nearing the Savannah River, which is the border between Georgia and South Carolina. This female is going straight towards Gainesville, Florida. This is a bird who genetically comes from wood buffalo National Park birds, a migratory population. But she spent approximately 4 or 5 years in Florida not migrating. She was released in Florida. They gradually used a larger home area. I believe that they were a strong pair that the people following them in Florida thought would be a good possibility for nesting. So they're clearly being migratory. All of a sudden, for whatever reason, the best hypothesis around might be that there was dry conditions, and so the wetlands weren't very good for nesting. These birds took off and went north. They migrated to a temperate area that's within the realm of possibility of being a breeding area for whooping cranes, and they tried to breed. And then these birds picked up and clearly are flying straight as an arrow back to Gainesville. They know exactly where they are, and they know where they need to go. To me, it's pretty striking because it suggests that perhaps much more of migration than what we generally attributed to cranes can be genetically held.